Welcome to Buddhism in a Nutshell. It is a 5-week course. We will meet all of the Tuesdays in July at this time for 90 minutes in each class. Buddhism in a nutshell is intended to be a very broad level overview of Buddhist philosophy. Um, and it's complemented by the other introductory courses that we offer. We often offer Meditation 101, a course called Introduction to Mindfulness, and also the introductory class that we offer. Another one that we offer is called Be Your Own Therapist. And we'll be offering that, I believe, in September and then again in November. So that's also, these classes rotate monthly. Be Your Own Therapist is sort of an introductory question and answer based drop-in kind of class. It doesn't have the same, it doesn't build in the same way that the other classes do. Um, so those are the three introductory classes that we offer on Tuesday nights, and our center, Tupten Norbu Ling, as you may know, is an FPMT center. FPMT stands for the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana tradition. It was founded by Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche in the early 70s. And as such, we present material from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, particularly the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism. That's the lineage that we represent in all of our courses. So all of the information that we will be discussing is going to come from that particular point of view. There are other points of view within Buddhism globally, the Zen tradition, the Theravadan tradition, but we will be discussing everything from this particular point of view. So today's class, the first class in this series of 5 classes, is really going to set the stage for what we will discuss. We will spend some time this evening talking about the life of the person who became known as the Buddha, the founder of what is called Buddhism now. It wasn't called Buddhism in his day, but what we refer to as Buddhism, the teachings of the Buddha, the one who is awake, the awakened one. And we will start to get into a little bit of the philosophical foundations by the end of today's class, but mainly that will be the focus of the remaining 4 classes in the series. Are there any kind of process questions or anything that's come up so far before we get started? Nope. All right. So, as I said, this is class 1 of Buddhism in a nutshell. And so, as I said, we will begin by talking about the life of the Buddha. And the Buddha is was born, as it says here, as Siddhartha Gautama. That was his birth name, his legal name. The Buddha is a title. As I said, it means the one who is awake, and it was the title given to him by his followers, by the people that supported him and followed him, and that he taught over the course of his teaching career after showing the aspect of um, achieving enlightenment. So, so Siddhartha was born, as you could say, we would say in English, was born a prince, is the word that they use. But prince, in in the way that we normally would think of the word prince, Typically, we would think of it as something quite grand, something quite, with lots of pomp and circumstance and great wealth. We would normally associate with that with the kings and queens of England or Germany or France or Spain. And what we're talking about here is the region of present day India, present day Nepal, but 25, 2600 years ago. So at that time, this region was kind of carved up into a number of, you might say, city states, small fiefdoms or city states. And they did have an administrator or a king and queen, you could say, of each of these individual city states. And it is a factual statement that the parents of Siddhartha were such people. They were the administrators, the king and the queen of a relatively provincial, relatively humble city-state, not anything as grand as we think in terms of England and so on. Um, However, the lineage of taking control of these city states did follow a patriarchal system. So, as the prince, it is true that Siddhartha would have become the person responsible for that city state. When his parents passed away, he would have inherited that responsibility and, whatever relative comfort and wealth was associated with that as compared to the standard of living that was more common. Certainly, it was elevated in a comparative way. And so, when Siddhartha was born, um, it's said that he showed signs of being special, being unique at that time, and he, was known to excel over the course of his early life in all of the endeavors that were common, for a person of his station. But it was particularly important to his father that Siddhartha um, follow in the family business, that Siddhartha not go and do anything else. And uh, his father took him as a very young child to, you could say, a seer, someone who was known to have some degree of clairvoyance. And this clairvoyant gave a prediction of Siddhartha's life and told his father that, um, that he would go in one of two directions, that he was predicting that Siddhartha would perhaps do what his father wished, to become the king of this city state, or there was an option that was open in his life path to reject that worldly way of being. And this seer indicated to his father that Siddhartha would be successful in either uniting all of the city states through either sort of conquest and trade and economics, kind of the worldly way of bringing together these smaller fiefdoms, or and that would be true if he followed in his father's footsteps. Or alternatively, if he rejected that path, he would take up a spiritual path in his life. And he would be similarly successful, this seer, this clairvoyant said, in uniting the peoples of this region of as I said, present day India, present day Nepal. Um, but he would do it through a shared philosophical system, a shared, you could say religion or philosophical system, depending on how you want to classify what his teachings became. Um, and his father, as I said, really was only interested in Siddhartha following in his footsteps, not at all interested in this other path. So his life was very isolated. His father didn't really allow him to interact with the townspeople. He wanted to sort of control what Siddhartha learned, what he knew about the world, in the hopes that he could mold, Siddhartha's development and kind of train him to just do the one thing that his father wanted for his life. Um, However, there did come a point where Siddhartha went outside of, sort of the family compound, what have you, into the local village, the local town. And when he did that, he came across what are known as the four sights. These were four different people, or at least human bodies that he saw in terms of the corpse. They were four different experiences or uh, um, ways of being for a human. So he saw someone who was extremely affected by old age. And so, as I mentioned, he grew up in this very isolated um, family compound, and so most likely never saw anyone who was, probably older than maybe 50, 60. And this person, we don't know how old they were, but it's quite clear from their physical body that they were experiencing a lot of suffering on the basis of their age. So they likely had a lot of, muscle loss, kind of very frail, due to perhaps being in their 80s, let's say. Um, and that overt suffering that he was exposed to was a new experience for him, not having been exposed to people of this age. Um, then also he came across a very ill person, and again, could have been maybe someone who, a leper, someone who had maybe a skin condition. You could just look at them and see that they had something that was really ravaging their physical form in a way that was shocking and that Siddhartha had no basis in, no prior basis in experiencing. Then he saw a corpse, a human corpse, very common at that time, still common in that region for open air processions of dead bodies through the streets, with flowers and so on, these kind of open air, carts with a dead body. Uh, and so what he was exposed to were these three kinds of suffering: the suffering of aging, the suffering of sickness, and the suffering of death. And he traveled to this town with his charioteer, who was, from that town, was not someone who had been isolated, who had been sheltered in the same way. And he was asking, when he came across the old person, the sick person, and then this corpse, he was interrogating his charioteer and asking, how odd is this? How strange, how uncommon is what I'm seeing, because this was all brand new because of his previous isolation. And his charioteer was saying, well, no, it's very common. If you live to this age, you're going to experience some degree of what you're seeing here. If you become ill in various ways, many people in society do become ill in similar ways. And so there's nothing strange, there's nothing uncommon about what you're seeing here. And then, of course, we knew, and his charioteer knew, that the only way that any life ends is in death. Um, and these were all things that Siddhartha had been sheltered from, protected from, kept from, really understanding about the human condition. We um, had these experiences too, but we had them at a very young age when we were 3, 5, 8, very young growing up. We had parents who explained all of this, and we were guided into this in a gentle way. But of course, we can all remember in our own lives the first time that we understood, that we were not beyond those kinds of sufferings either. And it's quite jarring, even, when you have that gentle kind of, no one's trying to keep it from you, no one's trying to kind of control everything. Still, it's quite jarring. And so for Siddhartha, of course, it would, be really earth-shattering, really life-changing for him. And and then he saw the fourth sight, which, I use the word here, mendicant. We could say spiritual seeker or a mendicant, someone who had very common, in this region at this time, there were a number of existent spiritual traditions at this period where people would devote themselves to various philosophical systems, religious systems of seeking something beyond just materialism, just what was common. And they would have this spiritual focus to their life, and they would wander around and just be entirely dedicated to this spiritual process. And he saw one of these sorts of people, and this was, likely, a meditator, someone who had cultivated, a lot of, really positive qualities internally, and so someone who had developed themselves, changed themselves in important ways. And that was to Siddhartha, kind of apparent that he was maybe onto something, that, he seemed to maybe carry himself in a different way, or he seemed to have a way about him that was obvious to people around him. And so Siddhartha was having this, kind of realization that he himself was subject to sickness, aging, and death. And everyone that he loved was subject to sickness, aging, and death. At this time, he was married, he had a son, so he understood, that all of his loved ones and all other, human beings shared this existential condition of being subject to sickness, aging, and death, all of these dramatic, painful conditions. And he suspected that perhaps, this spiritual wanderer was onto something, had some ability to maybe find a solution, that maybe there was a solution already that people knew about, or maybe by applying himself, if there wasn't, maybe he could come to understand some way out of this existential condition that he knew that he would otherwise face and that all of his loved ones would otherwise be facing. Um, yeah. So are there any questions or anything so far uh, before we go on? Okay. So the Buddha was, or not the Buddha, but Siddhartha was born in a town called Lumbini in Nepal, which is just over the border between, as I said, present day India, present day Nepal. Lumbini is on the Nepali side of this present configuration, but really just right over the border. And he was born. His mother is understood to have given birth to him while she herself was kind of out for a walk. She just kind of went into labor out on a walk, and that is it's thought that people know kind of generally where that took place. Um, and they've erected this temple. It's called the Maya Devi Temple. Maya was his mother's name, his birth mother. And at the site, the general site where they believe that they understand that he was born, they have erected this temple, as I said, called the Maya Devi Temple. And these are just some pictures, of the Maya Devi Temple. This is inside the temple. Again, of course, this was, as I said, 2,600 years ago. So, really kind of just left mostly with ruins. But again, these are just pictures of what was excavated and what's inside the temple. And this is inside this temple, there is sort of a glass or Lexcan case um, where this paving stone is thought to be the actual paving stone, presented as the actual paving stone, where this outdoor path that his mother was walking on, where she actually gave birth. She passed away shortly after having given birth to Siddhartha, and so he was raised by mainly his father. She passed away shortly thereafter. So this you may have to go full screen to see to see this. This just traces the path. So going back to this period now after the four sites, Siddhartha decides, on the basis of his understanding of this existential condition, he decides to adopt the life of a spiritual wanderer, a spiritual seeker. And so he first he follows all of the, as I mentioned, these existent traditions that were prevalent. And really, at the time, the prevailing view was that if you punished the body, that the spirit or the soul, whatever however you phrased it, that aspect could transcend the physical form um, by depriving the body. These really ascetic practices were common, and that's what he practiced for a number of years. He really practiced these extreme ascetic traditions. And you can find, not really so much in the Tibetan tradition, but in the Theravadan tradition, you can find statues and depictions, artistic depictions of what's called the starving Buddha, which actually refers to a period during this training, which was before he showed the aspect of achieving enlightenment. So would still have been referred to as Siddhartha during that time. But by following these extreme ascetic practices, he was quite near death at a certain point. And at that point, it is said that, he one day was meditating at the side of a river and, as I mentioned, was quite near death, having followed these really harsh practices. And he observed a musician who was on a raft of some sort coming down this river, and the musician had some sort of a stringed instrument, and the musician was producing really beautiful music from Siddhartha's perspective. And um, Siddhartha had this insight that the musician was only able to produce this incredibly beautiful music because his instrument was tuned appropriately. The strings of the instrument were not, overly tightened, which would produce a very harsh, very discordant sound, nor were they so loose that no sound was produced. And he likened that to, his body, his practice, and he recognized that he had gone too far, that he was mistaken um, in following these ascetic practices, that his instrument of the body and the mind were too negatively impacted by those practices to produce spiritual realization. So he began to take food in reasonable amounts. He began to nourish his body again. Um, and then, he kind of abandoned, as I said, he abandoned that previous training, that previous, way of doing things that was so common at the time. And he traveled to, as it shows here in the slide, he traveled to what's called Bodh Gaya in India, present day India. And this was the place, after having changed, adjusted his practice, his approach in Bodh Gaya, he now uh, shows the aspect of achieving enlightenment in Bodh Gaya. And oops. So now I just have some pictures of present day Bodh Gaya. This is a picture of what is referred to as the Bodhi tree, uh, the tree under which the Buddha achieved enlightenment, showed the aspect of achieving enlightenment. It's not, the tree that's there presently in Bodh Gaya is not the same exact tree from 2,600 years ago. It's a descendant of that tree. There were saplings that were taken and kind of replanted and so on. So it's thought to be a sapling in a line of saplings from the original tree, but that tree is not 2,600 years old. But from what I, would infer from that, the tree was taken care of and, nurtured over this period of time. And being the place of the Buddha's enlightenment, just like the Maya Devi temple, there are many temples and different things in Bodh Gaya, present day Bodh Gaya. So again, just have some pictures to share from present day Bodh Gaya, different statues and temples and things that exist now in that place. So This slide after the Buddha's enlightenment, so the Buddha, shows the aspect of achieving enlightenment in Bodh Gaya. And at this point, for the rest of his life, he travels and he teaches the people that he comes across. He just all of the sutras, if you read the sutras, they all start with, the Buddha or the Blessed One or the Tathagata, these different epithets of the Buddha, was in such and such a place at such and such a time. He came across one person or a group of people. They asked him a question, and then he gave some, he answered the question. He was trying to be beneficial to whomever he came across. He was trying to help all of the different people that he came across as he traveled across, I would assume mainly what's present day India, given how large present day India is. So this slide depicts a, a potential route that he may have taken. I think it's, if you use Google Maps and you say, go from Bodh Gaya to Sarnath, this is sort of the most direct way of doing that. So he crossed the river at some point. There's quite a river there, so he would have crossed that, and he ends up in Sarnath, in Deer Park, Sarnath, where he gives his first kind of major discourse, major teaching, which is called the Teaching on the Four Noble Truths. His first kind of major address that is expressing what he uncovered by his achieving of enlightenment, by his um, process of uncovering the the nature of his own mind, his own uh, capacity for the full flourishing of his potential, which is what we now were just referred to as enlightenment, the complete development, the complete perfection of what mind or consciousness is capable of. The Buddha, the historical Buddha, is one sentient being who engaged in a process that brought about that result. And the historical Buddha subsequent to that began to explain to everybody that he came across in various ways what process he used to reach that result, to uncover that ability, that capacity of his own mind. And this first major discourse, as I said, happened at Sarnath, or also called Deer Park, and where he taught the Four Noble Truths, which, I'm sure we've all heard before, at least to some degree. So again, being the place of this first major discourse, there are again now many temples, many statues in present day Sarnath, present day Deer Park. And so again, just have some pictures that um, show what has been constructed at that site of his first major discourse, all of these temples and so on. All right. So again, just pause briefly. Have any thoughts or questions arisen? Nope. All right. So, as I mentioned, that his first major discourse was on the Four Noble Truths. So we'll start to look at that teaching. And really, everything that the Buddha, the person now, the one who is awake, which, awakened to the way things are, awakened to the nature of reality, you could say. Um, all of the teachings of the Buddha that came after the teaching on the Four Noble Truths really was just a further elaboration of one or more of the Four Noble Truths. Everything that the Buddha ever taught is really condensable to the Four Noble Truths, being having some relation to one or more of the Four Noble Truths. Uh, okay, so the first of the Four Noble Truths all of these can be translated in slightly different ways, phrased in slightly different ways. You may have heard it packaged or phrased as, something like life is suffering, um, or there is suffering. Um, but another way of phrasing it is just the truth of, there's different, I guess I say there's different ways. You could say the truth of unsatisfactory conditions, is another way of phrasing it. Um, so because, or, you could say what is true suffering, rather than, so certainly the packaging of life is suffering is maybe a little bit too extreme in terms of what is actually taught in the First Noble Truth. Um, the truth of unsatisfactory conditions, or what true suffering is, um, those are better ways of thinking about the First Noble Truth. Um, and as we go along, we will contrast what the Buddha taught as one who is awake to the actual nature of things, um, compared to someone like us, someone who's not awake, someone who doesn't see the world, doesn't understand the world in the same way that one who is awake understands or sees the world, because we have our own version of these four things. And the problem is that our version is mistaken as compared to the Buddha's version. So, we have some understanding of suffering, right, of unsatisfactory conditions. That's true, but our understanding of it is not the same as the Buddha's understanding of it. And we will see that with regard to all of the Four Noble Truths, we have a version of it that is different, that is not as accurate, not as deep, not as profound, not as true or accurate as what the Buddha taught about these topics. So, with regard to what suffering or unsatisfactory conditions truly are, the Buddha gives us three divisions of understanding what unsatisfactory conditions really ought to be understood to be. Uh, and the first is, as it says here, the suffering of pain, or sometimes called the suffering of suffering. And this is not particularly difficult to understand. We as ordinary sentient beings and the Buddha would be largely in agreement on what is the suffering of suffering, what is the suffering of pain. Um, it is any unpleasant or unwanted, unwished for overt physical or mental experience or distress. So anything, happening in the body, happening in the mind that is uncomfortable, that a person, when they experience it, they would wish not to be experiencing it. They would wish for it to cease. They would wish to be separated from it. So, sickness, any kind of loss, any kind of frustration, pain, anxiety, depression, loneliness, being, frustrated in your desires, your interests, being separated from that which you find pleasurable, that which you find desirable. These are all, so you could just stop someone on the street and you could say, tell me about suffering, tell me about pain. And you could do that 10,000 times and get a very long list of divorce and losing a loved one, all kinds of things. And the Buddha, would say, yep, that's true. Everything that ordinary sentient beings are, putting on this list that qualifies as the suffering of suffering. The the way in which maybe, the Buddha and us would differ on this aspect of the suffer of true suffering, what truly unsatisfactory conditions are like, is that we, from the Buddhist perspective, it's likely that we would be minimizing to some degree how often this sort of thing happens. Um, we, from the Buddhist perspective, this is relatively constant, there's always something kind of not going perfectly well in the body, the mind. We're always a little bit annoyed with things or always a little bit frustrated with things. Um, the body is always giving us some sort of ache or pain, and because it's so um, typical, because it's, kind of every moment to some degree, we sort of don't account for how much of our lives is influenced by the suffering of suffering. We kind of think, well, if I'm not actually getting divorced, if someone didn't actually die, if I'm not actually, you know, but if we think about how much time hunger, arises, we think, well, if I can do something about my hunger, or if I can do something about my thirst, then it's not really suffering. It's only the people who are starving, who are, truly, that's suffering. But really, if you think about even someone who has access to a lot of resources, who has access to a lot of ways of altering their experience, they get hot, they get cold, they get hungry, they get thirsty, they get headaches, they get, stuck in traffic. Most of their waking life, is not exactly how they would prefer it to be, even if, they've got the ability to pretty quickly or even, often fairly effectively try to do something about that experience. So I do think that maybe we minimize it, and that's certainly something to consider, to think about. And so then, but then the second one, the suffering of change, is really the more important category of true suffering or division of true suffering. And the reason why that's true, the reason why that's true is because, again, if you polled, tens of thousands of people just off of the street, ordinary people, and you asked them to tell you about what brings them happiness, What do they direct their life toward? What are they striving for? Um, what do they seek out, on a daily basis to kind of soothe themselves or to bring a sense of contentment? Um, they would say things like, being able to go to the beach, being able to read a good book, being able to spend time with loved ones, being able to listen to the music that I enjoy, being able to, relax and take it easy after a hard day. Again, hundreds of thousands of different things. You would get another list of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of different things, but they would all be similar: being able to eat the food that I enjoy, being able to have access to, dessert, every day, or, what have you. And the problem here is that this list is a list that the Buddha would say, well, no, it's not true that this is a list of things that make people happy, that bring happiness. Um, the Buddha would say nothing on this list is in the nature of happiness, whether it's good food or a good movie or a good book or calling up a friend and catching up. None of these activities are actually able to make anyone happy. They don't have that capacity. And so what the Buddha is saying, that we are wrong about the nature of all of these activities, objects, and so on, because we think that the purpose of our life is to strive to accumulate all of these things, to be in contact with all of these things. We want to be separate from all of the things in the first list, and so that's an important um, focus of our life. But the other important focus of our life is to be as consistently in contact with everything on this second list as we possibly can, all day, every day, without break, if possible, to whatever degree is possible. And we think that that's what a successful life is, avoiding that which is painful and being in contact with that which is pleasant, which makes people, brings people happiness. And the way that the Buddha describes what's really happening here is kind of, there's a psychological process that the Buddha says is unfolding in our subjective experience. So when we think about all of these activities or objects that we want to bring into our experience, the what you could call pleasure-seeking behavior, it begins with a sense that something isn't quite right. It begins with a feeling of, that the present moment needs to be improved upon, that I'm not happy presently. I need, to find that music or that book or that movie or that friend or that food, because the present moment is lacking that. And if it didn't lack that, if it contained that, then I would be happy. So there's a dissatisfaction that is arising in our minds before we engage in the pleasure-seeking behavior. So the whole chain of events starts out with pain, with suffering, with unsatisfactoriness arising in our mind. And so, kind of off the bat, that's not great. Like we wish to be separated from whatever is happening. And so then, okay, we have that agitation. There's an agitation, there's a distress, there's something going on in the mind that we want to soothe. We want to um, deal with our boredom. We want to deal with our anxiety, our loneliness, our hunger, our thirst, our boredom, etc. So then whatever we individually have access to, and that's going to vary person to person, um, and our interests and what seems effective for us based on our past experiences. But we're going to engage in some process of looking at what's available to us given our access to resources, our interests, and so on. We're going to make a plan to go to a movie, to call a friend, to put an album on, to pick up a good book, to go out in nature. We're going to make a plan, and we're going to try to execute that plan. We're going to try to bring some external experience into our present experience. And assuming, best case scenario, right, we're successful. We say, what movies are playing today. We get a list, and we're like, oh, I saw the trailer for that movie. I remember that looked interesting. So I've got $20, totally fine, nothing to do today. I'm gonna go and see that movie. So you go, it's not sold out. You can get the seat that you want. You get your popcorn, your soda. Your whole plan worked out exactly as you had intended. That's, best case scenario. But so then the movie starts to play, and for maybe if we're right and we enjoyed, we thought it was going to be a good movie, based on knowing our preferences, and it really was. It kept our interest, it kept our attention. We were engaged. So, for the whole 2 hours, we felt better, right? We brought something new, novel into our experience. And well, like, yeah, that was cool. That was interesting. I had a good time for that period. However, if what happens next is that, straps emerge out of the chair that we were in, right? And it binds our wrists and our ankles, and the movie plays over again, and we can't leave, then most likely we didn't enjoy it enough to want to spend another 2 hours engaging in it. Maybe we did. Maybe it was amazing. Maybe it was the best movie we ever saw. But then we let's assume it plays through again, and now the third time, these we're still strapped right to this seat. We still can't get up, and it's playing again. There's going to come a point where it doesn't matter what activity we chose, whether it's our best friend that we're hanging out with, whether it's a museum, whether it's a beach, whether it's a fancy meal, it doesn't matter. And it could vary depending on the specific stimulus and our state of mind. But if we were in contact with that thing, the very thing that we chose, right? No one chose it for us. We weren't prevented from engaging in it. We successfully did all of the things that we said, "Oh, I'm I'm lonely now, I'm bored now, I'm anxious now. But if I possess this thing, then I won't be. Then I will be happy. The boredom, the unpleasant, the depression, the loneliness, that's painful. The movie, the beach, that's pleasurable. That's enjoyable. So I don't want to be in this distress. I want to be having a good time. So I'm going to go have this good time. If that good time uh, just lasts for longer than we intended, we ourselves will begin to experience it as pain. We ourselves will wish to be separated from it. If we eat an amazing meal, and then again we're told we can't leave, and the waiter brings out all of the same courses again. And, now we're pretty full. We're going to start to develop aversion toward that amazing food. It could be an album that, we really enjoy. Maybe we liked it. Maybe we were excited to listen to it twice or three times. 10 times, we're going to be like, this is awful. I cannot listen to this, my favorite album yet again. And so, what's happening in the mind from the Buddhist perspective is that, as I mentioned, we started out with anxiety or some aversive experience in the mind, right? Some agitation was present in the mind. We introduce a new stimulus uh, into our experience. And momentarily, we feel like that previously experienced painful stimulus is now gone. We've removed ourselves from it by introducing this new stimulus. So we experience a moment of like relaxation, of, kind of a release of that previously felt discomfort, unpleasant experience, because we're having a new experience that's different than it was, that we knew that, or we hoped that, or we had some reason to think would be something that resonated with us. But that new stimulus, in and of itself, it comes along with its own attendant dissatisfactoriness that's baked into that experience. And the more we engage with that new stimulus, the louder that signal becomes in the mind, the more attuned we are to the unsatisfactory quality of whatever it was. Because we are further and further in time from that initial change in our experience, that initial state change from the boredom to now having something to do. We haven't been bored in quite a while because this stimulus is ongoing. And so the unpleasantness that is baked into the new stimulus becomes more and more noticeable to our minds in our own direct experience. And we naturally, spontaneously begin to perceive it as aversive, as something that now we wish to again be separated from. And now we have to find another new stimulus to bring into our experience to get rid of that what's now painful. We spent a whole day at the beach, but then, toward the end of it, we're tired, we're a little bit sunburned, we've got, sand is itching our bodies, we've got salt, kind of drying on our skin. Um, we're just like, okay, that was cool, that was fine. But, you know, the first moment of being at the beach was great. But then 5 hours later, over the course of that 5 hours, we got more and more over it, right? It became less and less exciting. And then there came a point where, like, okay, now I'm going to go home and I'm going to take a shower, change into my pajamas, put on good music. I'm going to have a totally different new experience because the thing that I thought was going to make me happy, going to the beach, wasn't actually that experience didn't actually last. It was fleeting. It's worn off, and I need to replace it with yet another circumstance. So that's the suffering of change or changeable suffering, that what we think of as pleasant will itself change into that which we perceive as is unpleasant. Um, And so, what the Buddha is saying is that we're wrong about things having a pleasant quality, things having, being in the nature of pleasantness. If that were true, if we were right that that it was in that nature, that it had the power, the capacity to make me happy, then I could engage with it more and more, and my happiness would only build. If food and drink and museums and music and so on, if these were genuinely in the nature of happiness, then the more I listened to that song or that album or ate that food, I could only experience increasing levels of internal bliss and happiness and contentment. But we can just think about it in our own experience and we can see that that isn't our experience. We don't ever experience these pleasant, quote unquote, pleasant objects or, you know, circumstances in that way. They do, in fact, become the source of our own discomfort, the more we engage with them. And then the idea of all pervasive suffering, this third category of true suffering or truly unsatisfactory conditions, just refers to the fact, and this will unfold as we go through the course, but um, Buddhism is in a way rooted in the understanding of body and mind being two different phenomena, and mind being a phenomena that associates with bodies for lifetimes, but then that association ends so it begins in, the coming together of body and mind, and then that association lasts, death occurs, and there's a separation of body and mind, and then the process repeats itself. Um, that's how minds work. That's what minds do from the Buddhist perspective. So, this idea of all pervasive suffering is just the idea that mind can only associate with forms that are conditioned by either the suffering of pain or the suffering of change or both. It because there's lots of different kinds of bodies in different realms, and they're not all exactly the same in how they experience unsatisfactory conditions. But there are no forms, no bodies that are completely free of all unsatisfactoriness in their own subjective experiences. So that's all pervasive suffering that necessarily, no matter what kind of ordinary form our mind associates with, it will that lifetime will be conditioned to one degree or another by the suffering of pain and or the suffering of change, for an ordinary sentient being. So we can, as I said, we, as an ordinary sentient being, we have our own way of thinking about unsatisfactoriness or suffering. But the way that we think about it is quite limited as compared to the way that the Buddha is presenting it, right? We think that, sure, certainly there is suffering in the world. Um, but we think of it as starvation, as war, as losing a child, losing a spouse, as poverty, these really abject, extreme forms of suffering. And we think, therefore, that the solution broadly is to have access to resources. And of course, we understand, that there are certain painful experiences that we're likely to experience kind of no matter what. But in general, we think we can avoid a lot of it if we get a good education, if we accumulate, a buffer of wealth, if we're well respected in our community and, people appreciate us, they speak kindly to us, they kind of agree with our perspectives. We think that we can manipulate external conditions in such a way that we can avoid kind of a lot of pain, and that, yeah, there's some things that will happen from time to time, but that it's manageable by adjusting our circumstances and and certainly you could say randomness or fate or something. We agree that plays some role, or we think that that plays some role. We would say that that plays some role, um, but that still that it's something that we can work on. And so the solutions that we seek are very surface level, right? We try to, as I said, we try to seek wealth and status and power and reputation, to hold back suffering. Um, but this presentation of suffering is much deeper, much more subtle. And so the solutions that we'll see are coming, because the first noble truth is a bummer, right? The first noble truth is depressing, but it does get better from here. Uh, we'll see that the Buddha's solutions are therefore similarly much subtler and much more powerful and much deeper than the solutions that we are motivated to use our life to seek. So that's why it's critically important to recognize that although we think we have this understanding, the Buddha is saying, well, no, this is true unsatisfactory conditions. Your perspective of unsatisfactory conditions is, in a way, false, right? Because we don't really acknowledge the suffering of change, in a real way. We don't think that there's anything that we can do about the suffering of change, for example. Um, so, it becomes really important to understand how those two things are different. Okay, any questions about the first noble truth? Yep.
Just for my own clarity, as you were talking, I was thinking, and when you gave the example of the movie theater or just being at the beach, I realized that those things don't cause suffering in my own mind. It's just my own mind that causes the suffering, right? If I'm at the beach and I'm happy and everything is going great and I'm there with my friends, I can be in that sun for 10 hours and not even realize that I'm in the sun. But as soon as my mind says, oh, it's hot, or something changes, or the friends leave, or whatever is distracting me is gone, then suddenly it becomes suffering because now it's there. And so, how do you? I guess it's like, how do you work with your mind? Or for my own personal, I guess my personal, for me, how do I work with my mind to get it to realize that none of these things are inherently causing me to suffer? It's just how my mind is attached to it or the aversion arises. That's what causes the suffering, not the thing. The food is fine. Like I can eat it forever if I'm enjoying it. As soon as my mind says, "Oh my God, you've had too much," or you're full, then the suffering comes in. If my mind never perceives it as different from what it was initially, that was causing the pleasure, then there is no suffering. I don't know if that's clear.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, what I would say is that from the Buddhist perspective, that isn't really what the Buddha is going to present as the goal. The Buddha is not going to ultimately, the Buddha is not going to encourage us to um, try to be, you know, um, unendingly content with, whatever is present in our experience, because although that's, I can certainly see how that's preferable, in terms of what range of mental experience would be open to a person over the course of a single lifetime. Certainly I can see, and so to some degree, there are ways of, on a more surface level, there are ways of working with the expectations that we go into experiences with that might set ourselves up for failure, in a way, these kind of unrealistic expectations that we have that make contentment more out of reach than if we could work with those expectations. And that's certainly true. So that's certainly possible. But, for example, you said, 10 hours, right? And that might be true. But what if it was 6 months? What if you couldn't leave that? What if you had to sleep on that beach? All of your friends had to sleep on that beach. Okay, maybe there was like food brought in, um, but that was the only experience that you could have. You would wake up with all of your friends the next day, and then you would wake up with all of your friends the day after that. When you say 10 hours, what you mean is that you understand that you have control over the next experience, being able to bring in a fresh experience at some point. So it's kind of a thought experiment that doesn't really generally happen because we do have agency and we do have control. Um, I don't know. I mean, certainly the Buddha would say that it is even possible to maybe train the mind to be able to deal with the example that I gave. Like the Buddha would say that it's absolutely possible for a person to train the mind in such a way that they could be imprisoned, like actually imprisoned, for the entirety of their existence, 50 years, 70 years, and be quite content, be quite okay with that experience on the basis of how they've trained their mind. So you're right that there's no objective outside experience that would cause suffering for all people. Because it does depend upon the mind that you're bringing to that experience. It is possible to be in a what would seem like a really terrible experience and not be experiencing it as suffering. But there's a different way of thinking about that too, that we are going to die. And so there is a deeper training that goes beyond just that level of contentment, because we may be able to train the mind to that degree, but then we lose this life at the end. So we may still be pursuing those sorts of what Buddhism would call worldly pleasures or sensory enjoyments if we're just trying to transform those worldly experiences and try to maybe elongate the pleasant aspects of being in contact with them. From the Buddhist perspective, ultimately that kind of misses a deeper ability of training the mind, because when we die, we don't know like what something's going to happen next. And maybe a lot of that training that we've done is also now gone because we're in a very different experience. And then we're going to die out of that life, and we're going to die out of the life after that, and so on and so on and so on. So ultimately, what we'll see is that the Buddha is going to give us tools to not only be more content, kind of with what's happening, but to train the mind such that the mind is able to experience enlightenment like the Buddha did, where the mind is abiding as mind itself, and there is no there is no pleasure seeking behavior. There is no, the present moment is perfected in a way. The subjective experience is perfected. And so the mind is able to abide in a perfected state, um, that is always and eternally free of any kind of, you know, wanting to engage in something, wanting or needing or being interested in kind of improving upon things. Um, the kind of pushing and pulling of pleasant and unpleasant is fully and completely abandoned from the very root. Um, and that is a permanent state that is achievable, and that's what the Buddha is going to present to us as the ultimate goal for us to aim toward.
Yeah. Yeah, I get what you're saying. I think I have this aversion towards this constant all pervasive suffering that as Buddhists we're so attached to and so drawn to. It's like we have to suffer, and suffering is what gets us out of samsara. And I get that you need suffering to have a level of renunciation to actually push yourself to practice to get out of samsara. But then I see where the suffering and the joy and the pleasantries, those are both of those are not mutually exclusive. They're as a result of my own karma. And when I read sadhanas and do practices like the bodhisattvas take joy in our efforts. And so I guess what I'm trying to find out is how do we find that have both of those coexist where we're enjoying and we're taking joy in the pleasures that we have because they are as a result of really hard work in gaining us good karma to have those joys and those pleasures, but not get caught up in it. So I think what I was trying to ask is how do we find that space where it becomes neutral, where we're not attached to the pleasures, even though we can enjoy them and appreciate that they're here. But then we don't get so attached to the suffering either, where we're just like, oh my God, there's a lot of suffering and I need the suffering. And if I'm having joy, then I shouldn't be having joy because I should have suffering because I need that to push me to practice more or to try to get out of samsara. Like, how do we reconcile both?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly it's true that as we as individuals progress, then we do become more and more skilled at having the tools of seeing things in a balanced way, recognizing that nothing is from its own side, nothing is, inherently pleasant, and nothing is also inherently unpleasant. So we personally do gain insight and skills that I think definitely provide us with that balanced perspective, and we ourselves would not experience, when you have those skills, those abilities, that mental training, you yourself would suffer less. They describe the path as, ultimately as going from joy to joy, right? When as you train the mind, absolutely, the mind, our experience, we ourselves become more joyful, more, um, we don't grasp at, we can say, well, this is a temporary, experience. It's enjoyable. I'm going to participate in it while it's here. I understand that it's temporary. It won't last forever. When it goes, I'll be okay too. I'm not going to grasp at it and think of it as, I'm not going to define my true happiness, my internal sense of contentment, because really, from the Buddhist perspective, happiness isn't having or not having experiences. Happiness is the degree to which the mind is free from grasping at experiences, needing, things to work out in a particular way. Kind of the unrealistic way that we push and pull pleasant and, things that we perceive as pleasant and unpleasant. Um, so I think at that point, ultimately, it shifts. Um, so of course, there's a recognition that this is what's happening for me right now, and still I could, that I'm not beyond the ripening of negative karma, right? Particularly at death. So that's a danger that I mean, certainly I'm training my mind. I'm gaining more skills, more capacities. And so things are going well for me. But certainly I'm ordinary, still. And so negative karma still can and does ripen. And so that still is a danger in terms of a kind of rebirth where I would have no capacity to continue to train my mind. I would be experiencing great suffering for long periods of time. So I'm not beyond that danger. I mean, there are beings who get to a point where they are beyond that danger, but until they do, like that's still something to be cognizant of, to be concerned about, to recognize. But also, I think that the emphasis shifts toward other sentient beings, and it becomes more about understanding that we are surrounded by innumerable sentient beings and they are suffering. And it's less about being worried about one's own suffering, and it becomes more about the fact that we can't really alleviate the suffering of others while we ourselves are still subject to our own negative karma, to these rebirths, these quote unquote lower realm rebirths where we can't practice, where we are, separate, where we don't have the conditions to make continual progress on the path. And what a shame that is for other sentient beings. Like they would be let down by that. They need us to become able to become someone who is able to alleviate their suffering. So, I mean, of course, you could say, well, all suffering, as you said, all suffering is dependent upon the mind and the qualities of the mind. But most ordinary sentient beings, the quality of their mind isn't trained to the level where they can just choose not to experience it as suffering. Their mind is at a level where they are going to experience it as suffering until their mind is trained otherwise, until that isn't true. So I think ultimately the point is that we want that for ourselves. We also want that for all other sentient beings. Um, so, it is about understanding um, that really we're just one, and so our suffering is, kind of nothing compared to the suffering of every other sentient being combined. Um, and we should ultimately find it unbearable that sentient beings suffer. And that is ultimately becomes, so I think in the beginning, as you said, they use the experiences that we can see in our own lives to motivate us, like you said. But then we have to recognize that we're just one sentient being, and that is also true about every other sentient being. And that really becomes then the focus, not so much, whether or not I might experience something difficult or whether I might not have the ability to transform a challenging experience. Um, but certainly, as I said, if a person can make a certain amount of progress, and then if they spend a long time, kind of in these unfortunate kinds of rebirths, there's no guarantees, right, within cyclic existence as a whole. So there is a lot of work to be done to set things up in such a way where we can rely on a succession of the kinds of rebirths where we can actually have access to these mental tools to have, because in the lower realms you don't have access to them. We can see that we can grow in them now, but there's lots of sentient beings where it's not an option. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, Venerable, what came to my mind when you were talking about how we try to do all these things to make ourselves happy, and then the death is coming. It's a bit like rearranging the deck chairs on a deck on Titanic. All we're doing is just trying to find a little bit of happiness, and then it changes, and then you die. The other thing I was thinking is that the feeling I'm getting is that all our suffering is pretty much related to our expectations, either meeting our expectations for a while and then not, or not meeting our expectations at all. Like Venerable Ravina says, you order chocolate cake and the carrot cake comes. That's where the problem is. Would you say that?
well, yeah, certainly. I mean, if, as I said, if we can train our mind, it's certainly there's a level of training of the mind where we can get to a point where we would not freak out, as she says, when we get something other than what we had intended. We can be like, well, yeah, this is fine. I'm happy with this. This is also okay. Um, but still, there was a moment where we thought that some kind of dessert was going to make things better than they were. And that's the problem from the Buddhist perspective, is that we thought that there was something separate from ourselves that we weren't experiencing, and and the truth, and that being true, is what we needed to deal with. And so we were motivated to order something. We were motivated to think that Buddhism would say that the idea that 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 domino, that chain of events, what set that in motion is all false. That there's nothing outside of oneself that we that we have any reason to be trying to bring into our experience, which is a much deeper level of realization than just kind of like understanding that restaurants run out of chocolate cake sometimes and they may have to bring us a different thing, and like can our mind be stable and okay when that happens. That's a much easier way of training our mind. But yeah, like you said, I mean, from the Buddhist perspective, we waste, as you said, we waste this life just trying to move from one sensory experience to the other, and hoping that those sensory experiences are mostly pleasant, that they tend not to be unpleasant, and we never really make space and time for a deeper understanding, a deeper, doing the deeper work of unpacking why is it that we are focused on anything that's outside of the mind? Why is it that we are seeking pleasure and seeking to avoid pain? Um, because the Buddha would say we can move beyond that, and we can just abide in a state of internal mental perfection that has no connection to um, bringing or removing anything from what is being, from the subjective experience. Okay, so we're a little bit out of time for today. So we will deal with the remaining Noble Truths next week. We'll start off with true causation. So, for people who are watching the video, maybe, the good news is that these Four Noble Truths, so we don't end, I don't want to end just on everything is unsatisfactory, because the Buddha taught that all of those unsatisfactory, like you were saying, all of those unsatisfactory, the reason why we have unsatisfactory experiences has a cause. And that cause, as you said, is in the mind. It isn't in the nature of the objects. There are no inherently pleasant objects. There are no inherently unpleasant objects. Um, but our mind is such, as an ordinary sentient being, our mind kind of unavoidably is such that we experience things in that way. So there is a cause, there is a reason why things appear to the mind in that way. And that cause, so that's getting a little bit better, right? It's not causeless. It has a cause, it has an understandable cause. And the Buddha would say that that cause is something that we can fix. There is a process. Not only is it something that we can fix, but that there is an understandable, replicable process that gives rise to that fix. So we can, what the Buddha is encouraging us to do is understand the nature of unsatisfactoriness, to understand what its cause is, to understand that that cause is not fatal, it's not permanent, it's not baked into the mind, it is fixable, and to understand that there's a replicable and understood method or process that reliably deals with that cause. And therefore, the first noble truth is able to be eliminated, able to be completely removed, completely dealt with in a reliable and completely, you know, infallible way. And the Buddha spent his whole life explaining how to go about that. That is what the Buddha himself did, and that is what we can do by replicating what the Buddha did. We ourselves can have all of those same insights and therefore completely deal with all of the downsides of the First Noble Truth. Um, the truth of unsatisfactory conditions. Because, as you said, it is a function of the mind. It is not a function of reality. It is not a function of experience itself. So it's a very ultimately, the Buddha's teaching is very hopeful, and not as depressing as the First Noble Truth would have you believe. And so that's what we're going to spend the course unpacking, is all of the details of. It is true that we have to understand suffering to a great degree in order to not use surface level methods. We have to understand the cause of suffering very deeply in order, again, to understand the depth of why it's present. And then we have to follow the Buddha's prescription for effectively working with that and freeing ourselves from being subject to the First Noble Truth. But the Buddha did it, and we can do it, and every other sentient being can also do it. So ultimately, it's, of all of the philosophical traditions, really it's the most hopeful, because the mind is perfectible. Our experience, our subjective experience, is not only improvable, but perfectible. And there's really no other philosophical tradition that asserts that. It goes so much deeper than, the idea of heaven and so on. So that is what will become more clear as we go on. Are there any final questions or thoughts?
No, thank you,
Good, thank
Venerable.
you.
All right. Have a great night. Take care.